Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. As you're coming in the webinar room, I want to welcome you. My name is Marche. I am the webinar director here at Advice Chaser, and we're so excited to have you here today. Before we introduce our guest and get started, I do need to do a little bit of legal housekeeping. Advice Chaser, the host of this webinar, is not a registered investment advisor. We cannot and do not give financial advice. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only and cannot be considered advice for any person's individual situation. Advice Chaser regularly hosts informative webinars such as this one, featuring a variety of knowledgeable professionals, many of whom are licensed advisors. Any opinions, ideas, jokes, or principles expressed by presenters are their own, and however true, funny, or interesting, are not endorsed by Advice Chaser. Please do not act on the information you hear today without consulting a qualified financial professional. Well, we are thrilled to bring you this educational presentation today. Just a few notes. Attendees are muted, but we do encourage you to ask questions using the chat box, and the presenter will answer those queries during the question and answer portion of our webinar today, and if it's appropriate during the presentation as well. If you ask the question in the chat box and we're not able to get to it, go ahead and leave your contact information as well, and we're happy to reach out to you after today's event to make sure that question gets addressed. We want this experience to be as educational as possible, so please don't hesitate to ask for clarification or expansion of the material. I'd like to introduce you to our presenter today in just a second. Let me go ahead and put her information on the screen here. There we go. Brenda Bridges is a financial advisor, mediator, certified divorce financial analyst, retirement income certified professional, and certified divorce coach. She is also the founder of Bridging Divorce Solutions, which helps couples divorce by implementing a non-adversarial process, one that is not financially confusing and not unreasonably costly. Using alternative dispute resolution instead of or in addition to the court system means families can own their decisions and design their lives during and after divorce. Brenda and her team believe in changing the unknowns of divorce to an understandable and streamlined process, morphing fear into hope and questions into confidence. Brenda, we're so glad to have you back. I know this is one in a series of webinars you've done for us for Advice Chaser, and I would say people are welcome to go to Advice Chaser and look those up. But we're really excited to talk about this topic today. So I'm going to go ahead. I'll go ahead and turn the time over to you.
All right, I'm thrilled to be here. When we were putting this presentation together, we wanted to make sure that it was user-friendly and not acronym loaded and understandable. So if I slip into that whole financial advisor ease, just flag me or stop me, and I'll try to back myself out of it. Because it's really important that this part of divorce is understood. It is, when you really think about it, all your decisions are either family-based or financially based. So we want to make sure that people are getting the right information to make those financial decisions and getting a heads up on what to look for, because it's one of those things where you don't know what you don't know. So when we put this together, it was really to point out the, I didn't think about those things. So people could know what questions to ask their professional team or themselves to be able to move forward and hopefully do it better and have a better divorced family and financial situation when they're done. So let's go. Top 10. So we did this kind of as a listing of mistakes to think about. And this is the first one. I would say it's one of the most important. is if you are treating your finances in your divorce the same way you would treat your financial planning in life or retirement planning or college planning, I would take pause and relook at that, because it's a very finite and individual situation when you're looking at the finances of divorce. But it also has really long-term implications, because the decisions you're making here, especially after a long-term marriage, or if you have a complicated financial situation or you have children, these decisions are going to have a lot of impact for a long time. So some of the things to be cautious about, if you are looking at using a financial professional helping you when you're going through your divorce decisions, I would caution against using a financial advisor who is not trained in divorce finances. It's specific. We take classes, we actually take proctored timed exams, and we have to do continuing education because the laws change and that impacts how finances are decided in divorce. So you want to make sure that you're not getting advice for your divorce from someone who might be an expert in retirement planning, but doesn't know the ins and outs and the mistakes that can be made in divorce. It's very different. We're also in divorce settlements looking at things very specifically, like taxes and what impact can that have down the road, or liquidity. Are you able to get to the money that you're making these decisions about to live on if you need, and so on. There's also a concern, or there can be a concern, if you do have a financial advisor who is joint, they're representing both you and your partner, and you're getting divorced, there can be a conflict of interest there. It's not uncommon for a financial advisor to have a stronger relationship with one party or the other as they're doing their financial planning. In some cases, one party isn't involved at all. One in the partnership takes care of it. But if your financial advisor is representing both of you jointly on an account, so what that means is if both your names are on any account that that advisor helps with, and then they are only giving advice to one of the parties while you're going through a divorce, that's a big conflict of interest, and it could cause trouble down the line. So an example of that might be, say that, one person is the house CFO, they handle all the finances, but they have many joint accounts, perhaps even individual accounts for both people. And while you're going through your divorce settlement, they're working with only one person and making decisions and moving money around that the other person is not aware of. As you're working through that settlement, that can have, it could have detrimental impact on how things end up. It can also just cause some conflict if in your negotiations, one person is going, I didn't know you did that. You didn't check with me about that. I mean, it's colloquial, but we can all think of perhaps times when that's happened in a relationship. And it just gets to be a really tricky zone. So worry about the conflict of interest and worry about potential liability. Financial advisors should be worrying about that as well. Mistake number 2. Okay, so this is looking at things in a legal versus a financial point of view. So what I mean by that is an attorney is going to come at your settlement based on case law, based on the law of your state and the rules in your state, based on whether it can be upheld in court or is sensible, would be approved by a judge. They're looking at everything through their lens, as they should, which is a legal lens. You should also be looking at or working with someone to look at your financial settlement from a strictly financial point of view. So how this might play out is if you look at the formula in your state, if your state is one of those that does have a formula for spousal support or child support, and the formula says you're going to get $100 a month for spousal support and $100 a month for child support, and that's what the formula says. Okay, that is legal. Move on with the settlement. if indeed it's going to take you $300 a month to live and you only have $200, obviously made up numbers, $200 a month coming in, that's not really a viable settlement. And then you tack onto that, oh, but in my settlement, I'll get a share of our assets and I'll be able to live on those. Well, oftentimes those assets can't be accessed without paying taxes or fees or penalties on them. So as you drain those assets to support, what might be a minimal lifestyle, it's impacting both your short and long-term point of view. It's a completely legal settlement. But some of that can be circumvented by looking at the finances of it and coming up with something that is perhaps more creative, still legal, but allows both parties to continue on with a sustainable lifestyle. So that's if you might agree on it, but if you can't live with that agreement, it doesn't work. And then when we think about how does that unfold, you make an agreement, and then a year or two into this agreement, you find out it's not sustainable. Then you end up back in court. And if you end up back in court, you're just spending more of your money and creating more animosity to try to be able to basically have a decent standard of living. If you were also filtering those decisions through that financial lens and working with someone to help you figure out what that means, then you're likely to not as likely to end up in court down the road, or end up angry with each other. And that affects families in a lot of different ways. Another thing to consider, legal versus financial point of view, is you might agree, and this is kind of the flip side, right? You might agree to something financially. So if an advisor is not versed in divorce finances and says, oh yeah, you can split that account, that's not a big deal. And then you find out that legally you can't, or in some cases legally you're forced to, then it basically nullifies your agreement because you can't execute it. So say one party has a pension and part of their agreement is not to split that pension. But I've run into this in some states. Some states say, no, for that time you were married, that's a marital property and you have to split it. Like, even if you don't care to, we're saying you have to. They might be saying that to keep themselves out of liability and trouble. But if you didn't know that going into making and agreeing upon your decision, then the person who has the pension might end up having to pay their ex a portion of that pension that wasn't intended. There's always a flip side, right? The flip side could be that they intend to separate the pension, and that's part of the settlement. Say, we're not going to pay spousal support because in 2 years you will have this pension and you'll be able to live on that, or the spousal support will end. It's part of the overall agreement. If post-divorce you find out that, oh no, they're not going to split that pension, and the ex says, oh, I don't have to, I'm not paying you. Again, it's something that down the road can impact you because during the process, basically all the questions weren't asked, and there wasn't a mechanism in place to make sure these mistakes weren't made. And the whole time we're looking at settlements, it's not only to make sure that they're viable, that people can live on them, that they understand what they're agreeing to, but that in reality they can happen, that you can execute them in a financial way. And this last point here, will it stand up, or are there a lot of fill in the blanks? Anytime I'm working on a settlement, anytime I would think any CDFA or an attorney is working on a settlement, we want to have that as buttoned up as we possibly can. So if you're going through a divorce and you're saying, oh, we'll get to that later, we'll deal with that later, just write it loosely. Things change, people become involved with other partners and other families, and jobs change and people move, like life changes. And if you have a lot of blank spots in your settlement, that is, we'll just decide that, we'll kick that can down the road, we'll decide it later. That can cause issues. It can again cause people to go back to court for a new interpretation or to have someone else make that decision. So we want to try to eliminate that as much as possible, that we'll get to it later. And while you're making all these hard decisions, make as many of them as you possibly can. So I think we're moving on to number 3. So this, if you don't understand the financial documents that you need and what they mean, then you're really not dealing with full information, nor are your professionals. So if you have a team that's helping you work through the divorce process, you want to make sure that you have the input that you need and they need to make these decisions, and that you're dealing with current information, not old information. And I've been on cases where I'll get a statement that's, it's 2-3 years old. Well, again, life changes and the markets change and account values changed. And in some cases, someone might have taken a loan out or even moved that investment and so on. You want to make sure that all of the information you're using is current, is accurate, and is fully disclosed. And if you're not the person in the family who has done all the statements, and this is common, it's very common to say, you know what, I took care of the household and maybe paying the bills and driving the children around and doing my job and all the things. And another partner took care of the investments and how those were planned out. Very, very common, but as you move forward and become divorced, you will be in charge of that other that wasn't on your plate before. So you want to take the time while you're making the decisions to get yourself up to speed and understand where you have money, what those investments are, what the nature of the investments are, and how all of this impacts your current situation. So I've seen cases where people might say, oh, my portion of our marital assets is going to be $800,000. That's a lot of money. I'm good. I'm set. I'm fine. I'm going to be fine. It's all. And then we start working through, like, what does it cost you to live? What's your budget? You're going to have to go back to work and augment that. Do you need additional training? What's that going to cost? We start working through the reality of the situation. And it wouldn't be uncommon to find that maybe you bare minimum are going to spend $100,000 a year, real money. So net money, not, after tax money, just to live a lifestyle, a standard of living that's within range of what you have been living. And you're not going to be paying for a country club on that. You're not going to be going on shopping sprees on that. That, especially if you have children and their expenses and so on, isn't an extravagant lifestyle nowadays. Factor in inflation and gas costs, and it's really not an extravagant lifestyle. But say you figure out it's $100,000 and you were getting $800,000. Well, that could last you for 8 years, right? And then we're just doing mental math here. But let's say that $800,000 is in an IRA and you're only 50 years old. So you're going to have to, if you access that money, if that's what you're counting on to live, right off the bat, you're paying a 10% penalty, right? So your 800,000 is now 720,000. So that's almost a year of expenses just wiped out immediately, penalty wise, if you access that money. Now, let's say that you're pulling that money out to live on. Well, you have to pay taxes on that money. So let's just say you pay 20% tax on that money, $144,000, right? So now your 720 is about 500, and I'm not doing the math right, and I should have done this before, but let's just call it 580,000, 590,000. So your 800,000, which might have lasted you 8 years, is really going to last you 6+. And you have to think through all those things as you're looking at your finances and as you're looking at what does this really mean for me and how I live. So that's part of understanding your current situation, but also knowing how you're going to move forward and handle this independently. And is there a way, that same scenario, do you really have to access that? Do you need to pay 10% penalty on that? What are the other ways that you can move forward, have a healthy financial situation, and sustain your lifestyle? And that's what a good financial professional will help you work through as you move on into your life post-divorce. Okay, mistake number 4. this is way too common, but being in a situation where you feel intimidated or not listened to is, in divorce, in my opinion, a huge mistake. Oftentimes people will sign on with a professional that, helped their cousin or their neighbor or someone they worked with who might have been a really good match for them and their personality and their knowledge base, but maybe isn't such a good match for me, for this individual, but they stick with it. So what happens then is their questions aren't answered, or they're kind of given the just trust me, brush off, or, let me take care of this complicated stuff. And then people end up feeling angry or intimidated or not listened to. And in negotiations, that can come out sideways and really hurt your discussions because of this bottled up, not being supported by your professional team. It can also cause bad decisions if you're not given the information you're asking for. So if you are in a situation where you feel you're not being listened to, your questions aren't being answered, maybe, like, as I said, we in these professions, we tend to, because we live it, use all these acronyms. We can throw out a bunch of 3-4 letter acronyms like nobody's business. But if you don't know what they mean, then how on earth can you decide what that means to you? So if you find yourself in a situation where the person or professionals you're counting on for support aren't giving you the support, aren't making you feel listened to, and aren't providing you with information you feel is necessary to make your decisions, look for another financial professional. There are good matches everywhere. The same can go for a divorce coach, an attorney, child specialist. You want to make sure that you are both surrounded with professionals who are giving you good information to make decisions. So down the road, you're not going, oh my Lord, what did I agree to and how did this happen? It was because my questions weren't answered and I felt boxed in. And this can be really hard, especially if you've paid a retainer to someone. So you feel like, okay, I've given them this $5,000 retainer. I have to stick with them at least until it's used up. Or by then we're so far down the process, I have to stick with them anyway. Usually the finances of divorce, there's much more than $5,000 at stake or the retainer amount at stake. And you can't necessarily put a value to emotional relationships down the line, especially if you have children and you are going to be some shape of a family forever. So really put a lot of thought into, are you getting the appropriate support? And don't be afraid to switch if you feel that you aren't, because that can be a case of, I guess you could call it good money after bad, but it's also a case of not valuing yourself and the life you want to lead down the road enough to invest in it now. Okay, to mistake number 5. Making money decisions in a vacuum. So this echoes a little bit about what we talked about before. An example is many states have formulas that are pretty cut and dried. Every state has different rules. Some states have no formulas, and it really is discretionary as to child support is different. That's much more formulaic usually. But for spousal support, also called matrimony, or excuse me, alimony, and how assets are divided, these decisions can be somewhat arbitrary. And if you pick a process, and we talked about this in one of our other earlier webinars, if you pick a process that gives you more leeway to look at what are the actual needs in our family versus what the formula is, then you might be able to make better informed decisions for your family as you move forward, instead of that, oh, this is what the rule says, so this is what we have to do. Is it enforceable? So the example we used here was garnishing wages for child support, and most, perhaps all, I'm not an attorney, I'm a financial advisor, but many states will do this. However, in a lot of states, they don't do it automatically, and the person requesting those payments has to pay for the attorney to enforce them. And if people are switching jobs, say the person who's supposed to be paying child support goes to another place of employment or leaves the state or becomes underemployed compared to what the initial child support was. In all those scenarios, then you might have been counting on that money and not counting on having to pay to enforce getting that money or getting less money because they want to have their contribution change because of their new employment status. My suggestion is you always take the what ifs and you work with your professionals to take the what ifs into account because they can change as, again, life changes. And then this last point here, the money decisions in the vacuum is goals, not percentages. So often in divorce, especially if it's going the litigation route, people might be hung up on, I need at least 50%, or I want 52%. Why? Because it's bigger than 50%. When in reality, maybe your needs are that a lower percentage or a higher percentage is necessary. And maybe those needs change. If you're making the decisions, not in a positional way, like I want to win this thing, but in a goal-based way, like what will it take for me to meet my needs, my children's needs, my ex's needs? What does it take? And if you're making those decisions on those discussions and goals, they tend to stand up better. They also tend to be more livable and they tend to create a lot less animosity or anger or distrust. So percentages, that really is a vacuum, and one attorney that I work with will say 0% of 0 is 0. So, 100% of 0 is 0, 50% of 0 is 0. So it's got to be broader based when you're making these money decisions and look at what does that money do, not just the decimals attached to it or the percentage attached to it. Mistake number 6 is expecting too much based on your state laws and circumstances. This is really common. And it works both ways. Like one party might go in after a short-term marriage with no children and no shared assets. So there's not that much linking that couple together and think you're going to pay me spousal support for the rest of my life. No state is going to support that. Flip side, someone after a long-term marriage who has been the primary breadwinner and the other party has, taken care of the household, children, and things on, but not earned a paid income. That primary breadwinner might say, oh yeah, I know we've been married for 25 years, yeah, but I don't think I'm going to pay you anything. And sometimes those declarations are made, I'm not sharing anything. You will not take my 401k. I'm not going to pay you any support. In reality, many states will say, not so much. Yes, you will. There are laws in place in this state to prohibit that from happening. So you really want to be in tune with what the rules are in your state, have your professionals explain it to you. And that level setting will actually save you money for sure, because you won't be, Don Quixote at the windmill fighting this fight that's not winnable. And you'll also have an understanding as you move forward, what's allowable. And I've seen it happen where people who are paying spousal support are very indignant or angry that they have to, but the law of their state says that they have to. And that's really hard to negate. And if they knew that going in, they might not be spending tens of thousands in legal fees and fighting so hard to not pay what a judge is most likely going to say you have to pay. So knowing your laws and adjusting your reality and your expectations for your state and knowing they're all different. If you're talking to your cousin in Maryland and you live in South Dakota, they're different laws. Know what to expect, and then you're just better able to make good decisions and not throw away money that just goes to supporting professionals if it's a fight that shouldn't be. Okay, mistake number 6. Oh, 7. We're on to 7. Mistake number 7. Again, I think these are all not uncommon, but making short-term decisions that affect your long-term well-being. Divorce can be ugly and snarly and upsetting and a whole lot of not pleasant things. If you get caught up in that and start to, or your spouse gets caught up in it and starts to do little things that undermine the process, some of them are malicious spending. Sometimes people get in the mindset that, I'm going to be living so frugally after this divorce that I'm just going to spend everything I can possibly spend now. That can be malicious, like spending it on other people and dating services. And it's hard to deal with, but it does happen. And how are you going to handle things like that? Short-term decisions like spying, like hacking into your ex's email, or going to be ex's email because you're suspicious about them. All that leads to a lot of distrust in the process, and in a process that's really hard many times anyway. So you just want to be careful in, looking at your actions, looking at yourself, looking in the mirror and saying, am I okay with this? And in a year or 5 or 10, am I going to be able to say, I took the high road, essentially. This can be for the person who is funding things as well. When you're in one of those relationships where there's a single wage earner, where for things that were always okay in the past, the kids always went to camp in the past, or you always took a vacation with your friends, for a weekend, or all of that. The vindictive no can be saying, nope, not going to happen. Nope, not going to happen. Nope, not going to happen. That can also have some really negative ramifications just on the, again, negotiations, the discussions, and how things unfold over time. So that short term can really affect the long term. Being positional is one of the things, like when you're starting to look at everything like I win or I lose, that's tough to come up with a good solution from that place. And again, that's the same thing as being winning based instead of goal based. So our next mistake number 8, we talked about this a little bit, not being explicit in your agreement, because things do change. And when folks come up with an agreement and we're talking about, what will happen if fill in the blank, and they say, oh, that will never happen. Still try to explore that what if and come up with a decision for how you're going to handle it. And it might be stuff that's really hard to talk about. And we're getting a little out of the financial in some of these examples, but one spouse starts dating after the divorce, and then money is being spent on that person, or the kids are being introduced to that person, or they're having overnights at the house while their kids are there. Those are really uncomfortable things to talk about often in the divorce. But if you talk about it when you're talking about all the other things and come to an agreement you can both live with, both sides, then you end up having a better relationship and a more durable agreement. Other financial things that can be like this is college. Some states have rules about funding college, some states do not. Intent can change. If you're divorcing and you have younger children, say they're 8 and 10, and you say college is so far away, we're not going to deal with that. We'll just, in 8 to 10 years, talk about how that's going to be funded. Well, in 8 to 10 years, one or both could be remarried. There could be other children. Financial situation could be different. There are a lot of what ifs and coulds as far as your own family. That if you decide how you're going to handle that while you're going through the process financially, then you both have the benefit of planning for it, but you also have the benefit of not addressing these hard things years down the line when you might not be in the same mind space or financial situation. I am trying to think, but I truly don't think I've ever seen a situation where those conversations got easier. They only get more difficult. So try to address as much as you possibly can and lean on your professionals here. Ask them, what don't I know? What are we not thinking of? What are some things that could come back that we should really talk about and make decisions about now? One that I always think about is, sorry, my phone is doing a weird thing. One that I always think about is when kids start to drive, because there can be a lot of unanticipated expenses there. Who's paying their auto insurance? What happens if they're in an accident? Who is taking care of that? How are they getting to school? Are they allowed to drive other people in the car? And so on. So just in your decisions, especially if you're going to be co-parenting, not married for quite some time with younger kids, try to make as many decisions as you can and draw on your professionals as much as you can. And I love my slides.
Or on being too accommodating.
Trying to make it bigger. Give me just a second. Okay, thank you. So being too accommodating can happen when you just want to get it done. You might be exhausted. You might want to move on with your life. Frequently, people don't know how long it can take. And sometimes it's how long it can take because of the rules of your state. There are states that won't allow you to get divorced for a year. Others have, a 60, 90-day waiting period. Some have no waiting period. But if you go into the divorce, especially if you're the one who asks for the divorce, mindset wise, you might be very ready to move on with your life. But system wise, a divorce could take a year, 2 years. I mean, there are some that take much longer, some can be done shorter, but usually the time frame is a surprise at how long it just takes to work through the system and the decisions. So people can get kind of a little exhausted by that and then agree to things that they don't really want to agree to just to be done. Sometimes people treat decisions like they are still married. They're still a married couple when these are going to be individual decisions moving forward. This can really be impactful when there's not an even power arrangement, if you will. So if one person was usually making all the decisions and they still try to, in the divorce process, make all the decisions, then that's probably going to be a lopsided decision or agreement in the end. And then the person who acquiesced and just agreed is suddenly going to be on their own, in charge of making their own decisions and living with what this situation was that they agreed to. Again, believing that things are going to stay the same. We're talking now, we're making good decisions now, we're working through this now. In 5 years, that might not be the case. So you want to keep an eye on the long term, keep an eye on the impact of your decisions down the road, not only to essentially crossing the finish line of divorce now. And another way of being too accommodating that does appear often is trying to keep the same parenting role. So this is especially, well, it works both ways. So say you've been a stay-at-home parent or you've been the primary caregiver time-wise to your children, and now you're faced with, you need to be earning an income, you need to be working, you have all these other pressures, and then you try to layer on, but I will still pick them up from all their sporting events, I will still be the PTA parent, I will still do all the things I could do before, plus cook them organic meals and tuck them in every night, and you build that desire into your parenting plan, it might not be doable. And on the other side, if you've been the parent who was traveling or away or working and you suddenly find yourself parenting your children 50% of the time, but you want to rely on your spouse to pick up the time that you can't be there because they always have, bear in mind that that is now your responsibility, and how is that going to work through? Okay, and our last mistake number 10. This is hard but huge. If you're looking at your settlement date, the date of your divorce as the end, you made it, it's over, I encourage you, don't. It's the beginning. It's a new life, but it is the beginning. So a lot of your team will fall off at the end. You probably, unless you have a few final things paperwork wise, won't have a reason to engage with your attorney past the end date of your divorce. If you used a child specialist or a divorce coach, in this case, you probably are done on the prove up date. But you will, it's your new beginning, and you're going to start living the life you agreed to in the settlement from that date forward. So as you move through that process, have a transition plan. Don't look at it as though, okay, I'm done. I can just kind of stop now and take a breath because that process is over, because there's a lot of follow-up work. Like, we work with our clients and do a new normal and kind of walk them through, here's what you need to do next. But you want to have your eye on, okay, now that I'm done, how do I want my life to look? What do I need to take care of? How do I put things in my life in place to make sure that I'm in good shape and then I'm not surprised down the road? Now, some of this is just going to be paperwork. Changing, there's a list here, changing beneficiaries, a quitclaim deed, so that if one spouse is receiving the house, the other spouse is giving up rights to that house. What you're going to do with joint accounts. Are they all going to be closed down? How will that be handled? What happens to the money? Like I said, a lot of that is paperwork. Another thing that can happen, though, is if you look at the divorce as, okay, I'm done, it's the end, but you don't go through and execute the divorce settlement. So you don't change those account numbers, or if you have a quadro, which is a qualified domestic relations order, and that's what's used to separate ERISA retirement accounts. If you don't execute them, and I've seen people who have come to me 3-4 years later and said, oh, I never got around to doing that. Well, if you didn't do it, the money is not in your name, even though it was in the settlement. And if the market changed substantially and your settlement wasn't written to accommodate that, then that can have a big impact. You know, you might think that you are getting $500,000, but the market value of that went down to $400,000 in the time that it wasn't moved into your name, then you only get $400,000. So you want to make sure as you move through the process, you move on into what's next with people who can support you in getting that done. And that is our list.
Well, it's time to open up the floor for some questions. And so I've gathered some here, and I'm going to go ahead and start. I will tell our attendees you're welcome to put some more questions in the chat, and if we're not able to get to it, we're happy to reach out to you after this event. So here's the first question. You talked about pensions being perhaps marital property. I have 2 questions on that. How do you find out if your state counts it as marital property? And does that apply to things like other retirement accounts like 401ks?
It does. So most, excuse me, most states will count marital property as anything that was earned or saved or acquired during the marriage. So let's use an example for a pension. So if someone started working at a company in the year 2000 and started earning their pension, and they were married at that time, so the whole time up until 2022, they've been at that same company and earning a pension and married, then that would likely be considered marital property. Now, down the pension rabbit hole, that pension may or may not be divisible as marital property. And how you know that is you have a professional work with you to look at the plan documents for that pension. And that will tell you if it can be divided or not divided. You also can request it's called the plan sponsor. So whoever the company is that's administering that pension, you ask them, is it divisible? And you find that out before your settlement is done, because if you find out after your divorce is final that it can't be divided, it gets really tricky and sticky. You may not be able to get any of it. You may end up back in court. You may say, oh, we could offset this if you're still agreeable and amicable with other assets. But you want to know all that before it's final. And then you're going to save yourself a lot of headaches down the road. And you're going to be able to come up with more creative solutions for how to deal with that. You'll have the right information to know what you're dealing with. So that's going to be things like a pension, a 401k. Those are ERISA plans. Those are sponsored by a company or an entity. They're not individual accounts. So anytime you're dealing with an account like that, it's going to go under their rules. They might be the state, a city, municipality. They might be a company. They might be a union. It really is whoever is the sponsor of that plan. So that's who you're going to go to find out how it can be divided. Could be the military. And all of them are going to have somewhat different rules. So you want to know your rules before you make your decisions to make sure that they match up. Now, if that's an example, if it's all marital, right? If same person starts working for a company year 2000, but they don't get married until 2010, and now they're divorcing 12 years later, it's not all marital. The first 10 years, that's individual property because that was amassed, by the persons working in the first 10 years. Now, from 2010, the time that they married until 2022, that would likely be considered marital property. That's joint because it was all saved during the marriage. And again, this is a rabbit hole situation. This is where a CDFA is going to look at that and come up with options for, here's how you determine the marital portion and the value of it versus the non-marital portion and the value of it. And there are multiple different formulas that can be used. And there are different ways of looking at it, especially if you don't have annual statements for every year. The other thing that we're going to do as we look at those situations is let people know what the cost is to look at it. So an example would be if you have a pension that totally is worth $50,000, like all in all, and you're going to spend a professional $40,000 on a professional to trace it and decide what's marital, a good professional is going to say, this is not worth your time. Let's come up with another solution. You can have a pension that's worth $3 million to each party. Well, then you really want to make sure it's an accurate disclosure and that you're looking at all the details. So much in this field is it depends. And these are really good questions. You want to look at the overall circumstance and then drill down to the details and then make your decision as to what is the best action for you. So did I answer both parts of that question?
I'll go ahead and ask the person if they have that question asked, go ahead and put in, or the answer, go ahead and put it in the chat, but I believe we covered it. All right, here's another question. You talked about the kind of financial documents that you would need when going through making decisions. Can you give maybe a short list of what those kind of financial documents would be?
Sure, I can. And we have a list typed up that we give to all of our clients. Any CDFA, I think, would. So you're going to usually look at the past 3 years of tax returns. You're going to look at any investment account statements, and those are going to be joint and individual. You're going to look at your house value and mortgage. You're going to look at pay stubs. It's like putting together a puzzle, and they all show a different piece of the puzzle. And when we gather all of this together, then we're able to kind of have a complete picture of the finances of the family. Those are going to be the top ones. If you have a pension or multiple pensions, then looking at those. 401ks are notorious for people not always having current statements and leaving them at old employers. So, especially as a financial advisor, the times that I'll hear people go, gee, I think I still have a 401k at that place I worked at 15 years ago. And they might. So it's finding all of that information and tracking it. And then it can get more complicated if people own businesses, then the business books might be something that is looked at, or partnership documents. As we talked about with marital property, there can also be exclusions. So if there were gifts to an individual, that's not marital property, but it needs to be agreed upon or addressed in the settlement. If there was an inheritance, it can or cannot be marital property. So if you keep it separate, then it's not marital property. If you put it in your joint bank account, it's considered a gift to the marriage. And it can, but doesn't always have to be marital property. But those are also statements that you would look at just to make sure that everything is accounted for. What else? Vehicles, vehicle value, blue book value, and that's, a pretty easy lookup. And some of this you decide by what does it cost to get the information? Do you want to have an appraisal done on the house to see exactly what it would cost, what it would be valued at? Or are you going to look at Zillow or Redfin and say, yeah, that looks pretty good to us, and you save $600? All of that comes into how you're going to determine your financial settlement. Then the other thing that is often overlooked is you want to look at your budget moving forward for both parties. And that's part of how you're deciding how you're going to live, what the standard of living is, what the need is. And that can take people a little bit of time to put together. And it's forecasting down the road, when this is done, what will my expenses be? Not looking at, for the last 3 years, this is what they have been, because you're splitting into 2 households. There will be more expenses. So you want to have that information to deal with as well.
Here's another question. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more. So this is just a yes or no kind of answer, but you can go into more depth. So
Okay.
on states' formulas for child support and spousal support, are those the minimums, or can they go, or does it have to be exactly that calculation?
So I cannot speak for every state. I'm going to speak in generalities. Generally, they are the minimum. Now, there could be hardship reasons that people say they can't pay the minimum, that every state is going to look at differently. And they're certainly, especially with high income. So we tend to call it guideline. So the state's guideline is, here's their formula if they have one. And then guideline, state by state, can be capped. So if you have high income earners, then you can go off guideline. And an example of this might be, so I moved from Illinois, what it costs to live in the city of Chicago versus what it costs to live in downstate Illinois is dramatically different. But the law is the same throughout the state. So there can be cases where you say, this doesn't apply in our scenario based on the standard of living that we've established and the incomes that we have. And in that case, it would be more likely to vary off in the upward direction. So I would say, as a big generality, look at that as a minimum. But anyone can make a claim for circumstances being different.
All right. Thank you so much. And this is the last question we have time for. And this is a good one about moving forward.
That's a good one to end on.
Yeah, this is a good one to end on. So the question is, how long does it take for people to recover financially from divorce moving forward? And I know that's going to be probably a general statement, but maybe in your experience, what you've seen with maybe divorcees that you have worked with after the fact, because I know you are in financial advising.
I can't answer that with a good answer. I'm going to answer it with the sooner you know your situation and have a plan, the faster you will recover. The longer you put it off, and the less, I guess, you bring a sense of reality to what your existing financial situation is, the less likely you are to recover. And the reality of that is sometimes people get what would be a pretty good settlement that would have kept them solvent for perhaps the rest of their lives. But if they continue living a lifestyle that they can't afford, then that money's gone really fast. On the flip side, someone can say, okay, here's what I can afford to spend. Here's what I can earn. Here's my plan for earning more. And they might be in fine shape forever. So it's not an amount of time, it's the amount of preparedness and action that you take given your situation. And it really, in my opinion, the longer you put it off, then the harder it is to recover. And the earlier you can attend to it and start making good decisions, ideally work with a financial planner who can walk down that path with you and help you figure out what the realities are. And some of it is hard, and there are hard discussions that need to be had, but you're always better off knowing what you're dealing with than, turning a blind eye and then being surprised down the road that, oh my goodness, I don't have time to fix this.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay, I'm gonna tag on to that one.
All right.
Look at that before you're divorced. Don't wait until you're divorced to look at your budget and look at how life looks and start making those plans. Do it during the process. It can impact what you agree to, and it can certainly impact your life down the line. So, don't draw a hard boundary there when you're, like divorce and life after. In many ways it is, but from a financial perspective, start your planning as soon as you possibly can.
Well, that's
Okay,
a good,
I'm done.
that's
Thank
a
you.
good note to end on. No problem, Brenda. I know that's one of the points you touched on in an earlier webinar. So definitely those of you who are here on this webinar, you might be interested in what we've done previously. Well, I want to thank Brenda for being here, and I want to thank the organizations that have worked with us to make this webinar possible today. Thank you so much for attending. For our attendees, look for an email soon with a link to the replay of this event, and you're welcome to share that replay with your friends and family. Here at Advice Chaser, we're all about helping you find a financial advisor who's a great fit for your life and your financial questions. Our matching service is free to you, and every one of our advisor partners has committed to offer a free initial consultation to anyone we introduce them to. Find out more by going to advicechaser.com and clicking on the link to find an advisor. Once again, from Advice Chaser, thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you at another webinar soon. Goodbye, everyone.